the Indigenous Education Network. And I have the pleasure of offering the first opening words today. And so when I say Sego Seguego, it's actually a greeting of peace, which I think is really important when we think about first words. And following what the Indigenous Education Network elder, Grandmother Shirley, has been teaching me about troubling land acknowledgements and actually offering first words and get people to think about what does that mean. So I'll start by saying that the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education rests on the shared lands and waters of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee nations and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Tkaronto has a complex history and has been the home of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people since time immemorial, and is part of the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Wendat, Huron-Wendat, and folks that, like, these are nations that also have a long, deep, and entangled history with this land as well as water. And with these words, I remind folks of the express commitment to remember and enact the tenets of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, specifically the principles of peace, friendship, and respect. The treaty, which symbolically stands at the entrance of the OISE campus, so you may have seen it when you came in today, represents an agreement grounded in Indigenous legal traditions and reminds us of our obligation to care for the land, the waters, the people, and to ensure ongoing sustenance and life for all relations. Today, Tkaronto is home to many other Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, South Americas, and the globe. And it's important that we acknowledge that we are working, teaching, and learning on these lands, and to consider what responsibilities that entails and the responsibilities we carry to walk gently, to engage in meaningful commitments, expressions of relationship, reciprocity, and also to care for land and water. So what does it mean to live well together, to walk together? And when I offer my greeting, Sego Seguego, and ask if you are at peace, what does that mean to live in peace together? I often think and trouble land acknowledgements through poetry. I'm not going to today, but I'll offer this. I'm really inspired by the work of Natalie Diaz, who asks, what is the language that we need to live? And so when we think about honoring the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, it's important to think about what is the language that we all need to live in this place. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Joseph Lessa, a professor of educational leadership and policy and associate dean at the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education. Dr. Flessa's scholarship focuses on urban educational policy and politics, comparative educational administration, and school leadership and policy, with an emphasis on leadership practices in Ontario and Latin American schools. Here at OISE, Dr. Flessa has helped to develop the First Nations School Principles course and is core faculty of the Center for Leadership and Diversity, also widely regarded as an exemplary teacher and dedicated doctoral supervisor.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Brandt, for the warm introduction and the thoughtful first words. You've wonderfully set the tone for today's important gathering, and we deeply appreciate how you recognized our dedicated collaborative colleagues and partners who have helped make this meaningful event possible. So I'm here on behalf of our fantastic dean, Dr. Erica Walker, who sends her greetings and welcomes also, and it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to this event. We're thrilled on a Friday, on a cold, very historically cold day, to have over 100 guests joining us, both in person and online, which underscores the interest and the appetite for this kind of event in our community. Dr. Walker started the Dean Salon series with the vision of creating spaces for critical dialogue and transformative learning. And today's exploration of Afro-Indigenous intersections represents precisely the kind of essential dialogue our communities have sought. These conversations are essential for understanding the complex historical and contemporary relationships that shape educational and social landscapes across North America, and our Dean's Salons seek to more actively create equitable futures rooted in justice and reconciliation. And prepared remarks. And of course, we're deeply honored to welcome today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Tiya Miles, whose transformative scholarship on Afro-Indigenous histories brings exactly the expertise that we need for today's vital conversations. As Canada's leading faculty of education and ranked among the top 10 globally, OISE has always been at the vanguard of transformative research, innovation, and teaching in education and human development. We continue to challenge existing paradigms and push beyond conventional boundaries, fostering interdisciplinary collaborations and nurturing inclusive communities to embrace equity and diversity. Our commitment to groundbreaking research, innovative pedagogy, and community-engaged scholarship not only shapes educational policy and practice, but also empowers the next generation of educational leaders, teachers, researchers, and practitioners. At OISE, we understand that education is fundamentally about imagining and creating better futures for all, and we remain deeply committed to driving sustainable social change locally and globally. With more than 100,000 alumni worldwide, our community spans the globe, and today's exploration of Afro-Indigenous intersections represents the kind of transformative scholarship that makes OISE a world leader and has done so for over a century. Today's event exemplifies our core values and dedication to fostering dialogues that meaningfully contribute to education and human development. And we are deeply grateful to each of you for joining us in this important conversation, and your presence here today, both in person and online, demonstrates the collective commitment we share to advancing understanding, justice, and meaningful change. Thank you once again for being part of this vital dialogue. And it is now my pleasure to invite Dr. Andrew Campbell, Chair of the Center for Black Studies and Education, fondly known within the community as Dr. ABC, to offer a few words and introduce our distinguished speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I hope you realize everybody noticed online. I hope you noticed we are wearing the same jacket.
Yeah.
It wasn't planned, the exact same jacket. It wasn't planned, but I've taken a picture and I'm going to be submitting it to some form of celebrity magazine under the section Who Wore It Best. And for those who don't know, he doesn't like when I say, but Joe was also one of my first professor here at OISE in 2009. And I feel the need to say that before I introduce you. We're sitting at the back having a conversation, and the conversation was about joy in work, in doing what we do. And I think it's important for me to center that we sitting here, I was a student, he's a professor, now we're both working here, and the discussion we were having was about joy in the space. So there's this narrative that many of us, we can't find joy or a balance of joy while we work for institutions. But of course, that is not true, because joy is a way we cultivate how we engage with each other. So I had to start with that. So my job is to introduce you. And so introducing the keynote speaker, amazing, Dr. Tiya Miles is the author of 8 books, including 4 prize-winning histories of slavery. Our 2021 National Book Award winner, all she carried, The Journey of Ashley's Sack, a Black Family Knapsack, was the New York bestseller that won 11 historical and literary prizes. Our latest book, which I put in my Amazon cart a couple of minutes ago, our latest book is Night Flyer, Harriet Tubman and the Fate Dreams of a Free People, which was a finalist for the 2025 National Book Critics Circle Award in Biography. Our other books include Wild Girls, How the Outdoors Shaped the Woman Who Challenged a Nation, The Dawn of Detroit, a Chronicle of Slavery and Freedom in the City of Straits, The House of Diamond Hill, a Cherokee Plantation Story, Tears That Bind, the story of an Afro-Cherokee family in slavery and freedom, Tales from the Haunted South, Dark Tourism and Memories of Slavery from the Civil War Era, and the novel, The Cherokee Rose. She publishes frequently in national periodicals, and her work has been supported by the MacArthur Foundation, Genius Award, a Guggenheim Foundation, Mellon Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and is currently the Michael Garvey Professor of History at Harvard University. Put your hands together for our speaker, please. Yeah, madam.
Thank you very much for that series of warm introductions. I greatly appreciate that. Hello, you all. I am so happy to be here with you. It feels like such a welcoming place, and I appreciate it greatly that I got a glimpse of the lake today. We arrived, my husband and I arrived yesterday, and there was lots of cloud cover. It's still cloudy, but I can see water, which is very affirming and invigorating. I'm grateful that we started our conversation with notions of peace and of joy. And as I share this paper with you, I hope that you will see the ways in which I actually try to reach for moments of joy, to reach for moments of connection, community, even in the midst of what have been very trying histories. So I'm going to try to set my timer here so that we have time for Q&A at the end. I want to thank the Institute for Indigenous Health and also OISE, did I say that correctly? For having me here and for hosting me today. And what I'd like to do this afternoon is to discuss Black and Native American ties and the study of those dynamics in the academy. So I'm going to offer a tour of sorts, a brief tour of the changing landscape in this field by sharing themes and arguments in a few of my own books that you just heard mentioned by title in Afro-Native histories. And also by spending the last maybe 7 minutes or so talking about my most recent history, which is titled Wild Girls. So let's begin with a bit of orientation. Carter G. Woodson, who is a towering figure in African American history, the person who developed Negro History Week, which became Black History Month in the US, famously said about our subject for today, quote, "One of the longest unwritten chapters in the history of the United States is that treating of the relations of the Negroes and the Indians." So he made this statement in what we think is the earliest published article in this field. His article was published in 1920 in the Journal of Negro History, which he also edited. And he wrote about Black and Native histories in that journal alongside of peers James Hugo Johnston and Kenneth Porter. Their work, done in the 1920s and the 1930s, created a foundation for contemporary scholars in this field today. You're looking now, if you're in the space, and I think also on YouTube, at a beautiful drawing by the Lakota artist Francis Yellow, which pictures African peoples, Indigenous American peoples coming together, meeting and exchanging gifts on what we now know as American lands. And the title of this piece, which I think is so gorgeous, is "First They Made Prayers, and They Sang and They Danced, and Then They Made Relatives." When African descended people were dispersed around the world through the vehicle of the brutal transatlantic slave trade, they landed not just in the old world of Europe proper, and not just in the so-called New World communities of European colonial settlements in North America, but also in the ancient cultures and communities of Native North America. Now, of course, I said so-called a moment ago because Native America was by no means new in the 1500s and 1600s when waves of Spanish, Dutch, English, and French explorers and colonists reached the shores of the Atlantic. The social, spatial, political, and cultural formations of already present Indigenous peoples were complex, long-standing, and like those of any human society, changing and evolving over time. African peoples and peoples of African descent who found themselves in Native American communities had to interpret peoples and cultures that were not African and that were not European, but that were changing as a result of the European presence. These Blacks in Native American places lived lives that held vast differences, as well as some regrettable parallels to the lives of Blacks who found themselves in European colonies and the white American states of the early republic. African American history and Native American spaces yields new information and deeper understanding about the richness, diversity, and dignity of Black life and of Native life on the land. Right now and over the past maybe decade or so, even going back to 15, 20 years, we're experiencing a flourishing of scholarship that's looking at the overlap between Black histories and Native histories. And it strikes me that you almost can't open a book about African-American history now or Native American history that doesn't look at the other population. I think that scholars would feel remiss in overlooking those connections today, whereas decades ago, when colleagues, peers, and friends and I were just doing this work, it was commonplace for those links to be ignored. There's also a new awareness of ties and interdependencies between and among Black and Native communities that really took a leap forward during the No Dakota Access Pipeline protests, which were around a decade ago now. And also the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. It was really incredible to me to see images sent by friends, especially from Minnesota, which is where I got my PhD, that showed Native American peoples, Anishinaabe peoples especially, who were marching in defense of the life of George Floyd. So my work has focused for many years on these overlapping spaces of Black and Indigenous historical experience in what we now call the US. And I've attempted to speculate about their meaning in the past, but also their meaning for present communities, to consider their implications for scholars' understandings of dominant narratives of African American, Native American, and American histories. A driving quest behind my work has been to seek out stories of the past that are imbued with explanatory power. This is a term that I borrowed from one of my previous mentors, the anthropologist Raymond Fogelson. So stories with explanatory power that can help us to reconstruct, reframe, and reinterpret what we think we have known about the past for the classroom and also for the public. I have tended to gravitate toward slavery, colonialism, racial formation, and nation building in my work. I actually have no idea how this came to be, because I am someone who is very sensitive about traumatic histories, and it's difficult for me to read about these topics. I can't really watch films about slavery. I don't know how I ended up here, but my mother told me that I'm here in this space because it's where I was meant to be, and I take that to heart. Mentioning my mom, which is actually not written down here, makes me think about when I was doing work as a graduate student, how I found a primary key document, which became the central text around which I based my dissertation. And it was a very moving document. It had to do with a family that was both Cherokee and Black, a family in which the Cherokee father possessed the Black mother. And the document was about his effort to manumit his children, but not the mother of his children. When I found this document, I called my mom for the Neighboring Library, and I just told her, this is so heartbreaking. What am I going to do? Why am I doing this? And that's when she told me that. So she told me, you're doing this because you were meant to do this. So sticking with that time period and moving back to what I had written down, we're moving back, we're shifting in time to the late 1990s, which is a long time ago and far, far away. I joke around with my husband that our kids say to me sometimes, "You were born in the 1900s." It makes me feel like, I don't know, that I'm riding around in a buggy or something. But so here we are in the late 1990s. I was a grad student at Minnesota asking questions about interracial and cross-cultural relationships in Native American communities. And by coincidence, maybe by coincidence, I don't know how these things work, I ended up going to the Newberry Library to start my exploratory research into a dissertation topic at the very same time that there was a path-breaking major Native American Studies symposium taking place. This was the 25th anniversary conference of the Darcy McInnigal Center for American Indian History. Now, really, I tell you the truth, I did not know this was happening when I scheduled my trip, but the two events coincided, and I had a chance to hear the legendary Indigenous Studies scholar, Blind Deloria Jr., give his keynote lecture at that symposium, which was titled The Future of American Indian Histories. And in that lecture, he talked about how Native American history was going to become, or should become, more comparative in its reach, that it was going to have to kind of look outward and think about comparative questions, experiences, and ideas. Deloria himself had written about Black and Native positionality within the American national context, and so it seemed that this might have been a natural point for him to make. But at the time, it really was novel that he was calling on people to sort of look around, to look outward, and to work comparatively. So I took that as a sign of sorts, and I continued to pursue that document that I told you about, that centered on the Cherokee family. And I then became a part of a subfield of scholars who have been doing intersectional, dialogic, or braided work looking at Black and Native lives. So it's been my feeling for all these years that this kind of work helps us to gain a deeper understanding of Black histories and also of Native histories. This kind of work helps us to see beyond the sound bites and the stereotypes that have accrued around these populations. And this work is not competitive. I think that sometimes people have felt that if we turn our attention, if we're in Native history or Native studies, and we turn our attention to Black history or studies, that we're taking away from understanding Native lives and vice versa. But in my experience, and I would like to offer this as an argument, the opposite is the case. We understand more of the complexity, the multifaceted nature, the needs, the desires, the wishes, the challenges, the struggles of each group by looking at the ways in which they have intersected. I've sometimes said to students in my classes that when we look at the history of the United States, we can consider Black people, Indigenous people, as having created the groundwork of that nation. The ground is, of course, the land, Indigenous land, which was required for the US to build itself out of. And the work in that term is, of course, the labor, which was needed to make that land fruitful and to make it economically prosperous. Indigenous land is the ground, extracted Black and Indigenous labor is the work. So now I'm going to shift into a very brief book tour of some of the things that I've done to look more closely at these questions. As I indicated, my work in this field began with studies of slavery in the Cherokee Nation. I won't tell you right now how I ended up doing this work particularly, but I'd be happy to talk about it in the Q&A if you'd like to ask. I will just say that I ended up focusing on the Cherokee Nation for my dissertation for a reason that is actually disturbing. It's disturbing in more ways than one. The Cherokee Nation was the nation that had the largest number of Black people enslaved within it in the 1800s in West Valley, the US. And also the Cherokee Nation had the largest number of records that could reveal something about enslavement in Native communities. And of course, it had a large number of records because it was being surveilled. So for two not very good reasons, the documentary record about slavery in the Cherokee Nation was fairly rich. And in this rich archive, I found a story about a Cherokee man named Shoeboots, I've already mentioned him, and a Black woman named Doll, who was a teenager when he acquired her in a trade, and the 5 children they had together. Shoeboots did own Doll, and according to the record, he never freed her. She ended up being enslaved by some of his friends after he died. But he did make an effort to free the children that he had with her. He had to go to the Cherokee Council to petition for their freedom, and that's that document that I found in the Newberry Library. This research indicated that chattel slavery was actually sanctioned by the Cherokee Nation. This was a question of debate at the time that I was doing this work in the 1990s. It was sanctioned by the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Nation government did actually gain economically from its promotion of Black enslavement. And it was mainly Cherokee elites who were engaged in enslaving Black people. The percentage of Cherokee slaveholders was very small, somewhere around 2% to maybe 5% at its height. But these individuals were extremely powerful. They were members of the tribal council, they owned the big plantations, they were the ones who were doing business with the US government, and they had kind of outsized authority by this time in their community. I also found in this work that even though this picture was bleak, that kinship claims made a big difference. That Afro-Cherokee people, even Afro-Cherokee people who were born enslaved, who could make the case that they were kin, that they were members of Cherokee clans, were protected by Cherokee communities and by Cherokee people. There are really interesting records that show this, that show the ways in which even Cherokee people who were engaged in slaveholding practices or slave trading practices or enforcing slavery in that nation, even these individuals were willing to go and try to bring back and save and rescue Afro-Cherokee people who were being enslaved by whites. If there was a kinship claim being made, somebody saying, that is my relative, we need to go and rescue them. So this was a complex picture, and it was a difficult picture to accept. But there were also some spots of hope within it. The notion that Cherokee kinship understandings could, to a certain extent, withstand the encroachment of racial hierarchies and slavery systems. What I'm showing on the screen right now are just a few glimpses of what slavery looks like in the Cherokee Nation through material culture. So we see on your left a brick plantation home that I'll talk more about in a moment. It's got the white pillars, and in the center another plantation home. The one in the center was owned by a man named the Ridge, meaning like it's like he was named for like a hill, like the ridges on the land. So he became Mater Ridge because of military service. This was his plantation home in Georgia. And the bowl, the pottery that you also see on the screen is another piece of material culture that in some ways counters the first ones. Because in those houses, in those grand homes, we see clear evidence of the kind of economic growth that Cherokee people were able to pull out of owning Black people as property. But in the pottery, we see a way in which Black and Native peoples combined their aesthetic interests and combined their skills. This is known as colonial ware pottery, and it's a kind of pottery style that has been found in the US Southeast and around the Chesapeake Bay area of Virginia. And archaeologists who have examined this pottery have said that it shows evidences of both African, especially Bakongo, and indigenous aesthetic imprints. So this dish suggests that Black and Native people were still influencing one another, even as these homes show the ways in which Cherokee people and other wealthy people in the Southeast nations owned Blacks as property. So my second book on Cherokee slavery was called The House on Diamond Hill, and it was focused on the plantation where the brick home that you see on your left is situated. It was called Diamond Hill, and it was established by James Mann, who was a Cherokee entrepreneur, a political leader, and a slaveholder who built a fortune in the 19th century. James Mann bequeathed to his eldest son 109 Black people. In my book on Diamond Hill, I tried to understand this plantation, how it came to be, and what its internal dynamics were. And I leaned very heavily into the work of the historian Stephanie Camp, who talked about the concept of rival geographies in her own work on slavery. I see a nod back there. Somebody's read Stephanie Camp. And I used this idea to try to think about this Diamond Hill plantation landscape as a rival geography. So yes, enslavement was practiced there. And yes, it was violent, but there were also ways in which Black people could find their own spaces apart to create community and support each other, and ways in which Black and Indigenous people could challenge this system of Cherokee enslavement, which was in some ways developed in response to American colonial encroachment. That is, that Cherokee people, Cherokee leaders were told by US Indian agents that if they would only demonstrate their level of civilization, then they could keep their land. We know how that went, right? It didn't go well at all. But slaveholding was one way in which some Cherokee leaders attempted to do that, to prove that they were civilized. I know this makes no sense because slavery is not something that I would describe as that a civilized activity, but this was the idea back then. Moving on, my third history was called The Dawn of Detroit. And in this project, I shifted my lens of analysis earlier in time and northerly and westward in space. I was looking at racialized and gender dynamics of enslavement in the Great Lakes area. I didn't know this when I started this project at all, but Detroit is a place, and Michigan Territory was a place where slavery was practiced. Many people have kind of discounted or overlooked the fact of slavery in the North in the US. And when they have attended to it, they have looked more toward the Northeast. But the Midwest was a place where slavery was actually an important piece of the economic system. This is the place, we're in it right now, to a certain extent, the Great Lakes area, where the fur trade was viewed as the most important engine of the economies there, and the fur trade was critically important. But I think because of the focus on the fur trade, we were not able to see the ways in which the enslavement of people was critical to those economies as well. I mean, there were enslaved people, especially Black men, who were being used to move those goods across the fur trade, along the routes of the fur trade. So what I found in this project on slavery in Detroit was, first of all, that very fact that I shared with you. Detroit was a space of slavery. And it was a space where Black men in particular were being used as kind of cogs in the wheels of the fur trade. And this was a really important and also very sad finding of my research was also a place where Indigenous girls and women were being used in an intimate and sexual style of slavery. So people who have studied or read about Black slavery in the US plantation South might be familiar with the term the fancy trade, which was basically, I see more nods back there. This was basically the trade of Black girls and women for sexual slavery. I found a similar kind of trade taking place in Detroit. And that is that Indigenous girls and women were actually the largest population to be enslaved in that area. They were being taken into white households, and they were having children who were registered in the Catholic Church records, and those were some of my major sources for this project. But their fathers were always listed as unknown. What does that mean? Well, I think it means a vast landscape of sexual exploitation. These Indigenous girls and women who were having babies with unknown fathers were bearing more children into slavery. Their children were enslaved just as they were enslaved. And in 18th century Detroit, into early 19th century Detroit, Native people, Indigenous people were being stripped, or at least the attempt was made to strip them of their original national or tribal connections and identities. So it's actually really difficult to find out what were the tribes or the nations that these enslaved, especially girls and women, were coming from. And they were being relabeled with the term Pani, which is a French term. So if anybody would like to correct my pronunciation, I welcome it. It's spelled P-A-N-I-S. And that was the term that was used to categorize and to describe Indigenous slaves, Indigenous enslaved people. So if you were Huron, if you were Odawa, if you were Dakota, and you came into the system, the records will say you were Pawnee. It is difficult to pinpoint where people came from. They did come to a certain extent from these nations that I have just listed. Just a few more images on this project. You're looking at an old map of the Detroit River, an 18th century map of the Detroit River. And the long, thin lines that you see coming out from the river, let me sit over here. All these little lines here, these were known as ribbon farms. Yeah. And these were where colonists who were French and then British and then American established their homes, and they most often had enslaved people working there. So they'd have homes along the river because the river was the highway, and they'd have lots that were farmed behind the homes, farmed by enslaved people, and then this would back into woods. Here, this big area, this was where the village or the settlement, the Fort Town of Detroit was located. Right there's the fort. See that tiny shape there. And Detroit at this time extended across the river. So what we now know as Ontario, this side of the river is Canada, but in the 1700s, this was Detroit. So people would call all of this Detroit. Detroit wasn't Michigan, and it wasn't Ontario. Those things weren't really solidified yet. And Detroit wasn't American and it wasn't Canadian. Detroit was its own extensive fur trading village that spanned this whole river. And finally, here, just a couple of images of some of those homes. So we couldn't see them up close when I showed you the map. This is what it looks like along the river. And the people who owned these homes, Lewis Cass, Elijah Brush, were also military leaders, political leaders, right? They were slaveholders as well, of Black and Indigenous peoples. So just to recap, my biggest findings in this project had to do with how the Detroit roots of the fur trade also marked a skin trade in Black and red bodies. and that slavery in the Great Lakes was significantly gendered, with Indigenous women and girls being the largest category of captives there. So I'm going to spend the rest of the time that I have to share these ideas with you on my latest works. One of these is Wild Girls, which is a short environmental history-ish project about girls outdoors in the 1800s in the US. And the other is Night Flyer, which is an eco-spiritual biography of Harriet Tubman. These two projects are linked. In working on Wild Girls, Harriet Tubman was a part of that study. And I felt that I just really wanted to keep going, thinking more about Harriet Tubman and nature. And the biography was an offshoot of that. So Wild Girls is really a group portrait of girls from a range of racial and ethnic backgrounds in the US. But the focus is on Black and Native girls, the two populations that I've studied the most and that I felt most confident in writing about for this project. Wild Girls was kind of an accidental book. It was one that was born from an invitation from an editor who invited me to write a short book in a series called Norton Shorts. So you know it's really going to be short when they call the series that. And she asked if I had any thoughts or ideas about that. And I had several years ago when I lived in Michigan, founded an organization for environmental education, and our focus was on girls. So I was thinking back to that moment in my history and how wonderful it was to have that girls organization. We had weekend programs, we had a day camp in Michigan, and we ran that for about 5 years. It was really quite lovely, so that was on my mind. And this was also 2020 when the editor reached out to me. And this was, of course, during the crux of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I was working at home alongside of my husband, who's also an academic, alongside of our 3 kids. We were all at home. My husband and I were teaching classes from home and doing our research provided from home. Our 3 kids were doing school from home. And pretty much every room in our house was somebody's classroom, right? I mean, one kid had the dining room, one the living room. We were just all spread out across the house doing school during COVID. And this was a time when you really couldn't go out. We were under kind of a stay-at-home mandate, and they also closed down the park in our neighborhood. One of the reasons why we picked that neighborhood so that our kids could go play that park. They closed the park down, and I remember feeling just so privileged because we had a yard. Not everybody has a yard in our neighborhood. There are a number of homes in the neighborhood that are apartments or, homes that are townhouses with maybe like a little balcony, but without green space that you can get down to outside. And our yard was such a blessing. Our kids could get out into the yard and just let loose creatively, but also their frustration, their pent-up feelings from having to do school and from being in such close quarters with family. Frankly, we love each other, but those could be trying times. And my kids and I also decided to try to share a yard with the neighborhood. So we created a fairy village, and it was just so much fun. It was such a joy. This is also not written down. I've got to watch my time. But we created the fairy village, and we set it up, and kids in the neighborhood started coming by with their families. They would stop. They would play in our front yard with the fairies. They moved the fairies around. Somebody left a note for the fairies. It was so cute. And then my kids wrote a note back. It became a wonderful time, even though it was very scary and it was very difficult. And we did have losses in our family, so it was very hard at that time. But it became just kind of a miraculous moment because of what was outside. So I get this invitation from the editor. And that's when I thought, looking at my 2 twins, and all of our kids are not girls. I don't want to leave one out. But, our oldest, our twins are girls. And I'm thinking like, okay, I'm gonna run a project about girls outdoors. And that's what became Wild Girls. It was a book that I wanted to write toward a space of hope, I mean, toward a space of joy, trying to help us to see examples in the past of girls who had, everything against them and who nevertheless went outside and were able to become more themselves, to explore, to learn, to push themselves, and who ended up being some of the most important political and intellectual figures in US history. So this book had kind of behind it the concept that the outdoors, even in the 19th century, was a place of imagination, a place of testing and trial, a place that was full of shadow as well as sunshine, but a place in which girls could be honed and shaped and could hone and shape themselves. That's what the kind of premises behind Wild Girls. And the first example I thought of in the first chapter I wrote was about Harriet Tubman, hence the later biography that I did of her. But I want to talk to you now about the third chapter in this very short book, which is a history and a story of the Fort Shaw Indian School in Montana. So just a little bit of context and background about Montana. Montana became the 41st US state in 1889. And it was at that time a land of indigenous nations and American military forts. The forts were established after the US Civil War as a way to try to control indigenous peoples. And in the Sun River Valley, which is in central Montana, there was concern on the part of the US military that American settlers were going to be in danger or at risk because of the indigenous populations that were living there and moving through there. The Sun Valley was a hunting ground for a number of indigenous groups, including the Blackfeet people, the Ani-Grovant people, and the Crow people. So this was a place that was just ready to erupt with conflict. This is the reason why the US military built a fort there in 1867. So after more than 20 years of armed policing in the Sun River Valley area, government officials determined that the Indian threat had passed. They said in the 1930s that the Indians were then subdued and restricted to reservations. That's a quote. So what do you do once you subdued the Indians and marginalized them to reservations / concentration camps of a kind? And we're in OISE, right? What do? You build a school. You build a school. So this is what the US government did. It turned Fort Shaw, because the threat's now gone, right, into Fort Shaw Indian School. And this was the first school of its kind in Montana. The spatial arrangement of Fort Shaw Indian School meshed seamlessly with the Army post design. In 2015, my husband and I actually went to see if we could find the school. I could not tell before we went. I did not see, it wasn't obvious. Yeah, any Google search that the military buildings are still there. You're looking at officers' housing on the Fort Shaw grounds. So the school was built into the military base, and they just moved in the teachers and moved in the kids from across Montana. So you all know what federal Indian boarding schools were like. I mean, you know that history, and the school was no exception. This school was created to force the acculturation of Native children into American society, but acculturation that would fit them for slotting into kind of low-wage work. The goal of these schools and of Fort Shaw was to sever Native children's ties to home and to force their adoption of the English language, Christianity, and Euro-American cultural ways. Children were made to dress alike, march in lines, adhere to dictated timelines, and to comport themselves in an obedient, orderly manner. A kind of enforcement of behavior which fits seamlessly into that military landscape and architecture. It was all there and ready for the children to be slotted into. I found a picture in the Montana State Archives of Fort Shaw students in 1910, which unfortunately I wasn't able to get permission to reproduce. But this picture, I'm going to try to describe it to you because it captures the mood and the way of life in the school. In this picture, you see long rows of identically dressed boys in dark suits and girls in white dresses who are flanked by formally appareled staff, and they're rigidly posed in front of a line of stark buildings on the open plain. This picture to me, you kind of said it all, and I wish I could show it to you. I hope that I sort of captured it for you in a sense. When the children at the school did not comply with the rules, they were punished in all kinds of ways, including corporal and physical punishment. The children were made to do manual labor, which was part of their training, but they were soon to discover that it was also their work that would support the operations of the school. So the girls were cleaning the clothing and the boys were growing the food and taking care of the buildings that made the school possible. The psychological toll of being confined at a militaristic place like Fort Shaw is one reason that the institution's records is full of stories of runaway children. A chronicle of Fort Shaw, drafted by teachers, reported, quote, "Since the Indian children were not used to obeying rules and had been accustomed to running more or less wild, they were rather hard to handle. Many of them disliked school very much, especially the younger ones, so they ran away whenever they could escape." Truancy was considered a violation of the school rules, and so when children ran away, the school staff would go track them, and they would also pay local settlers $5 for the return of a child. Now, when I read this, of course, I also work on slavery, and those echoes were very loud in my head. Catch a child who's running away, you get paid, you get rewarded. In addition to attempting escape, the children at Fort Shaw did all kinds of things to make known their resistance to this school setting. They started fires, they sabotaged school supplies, they secretly broke rules, they secretly retained indigenous cultural and spiritual practices, and they also did something else that I think was a form of resistance. That is, they played a game and they won. And that game was basketball. It was indigenous girls who brought basketball to Fort Shaw, and they ended up becoming what was described at the time as champions of the world, so basketball champions of the world. Now, this is, of course, a complex story. There are a lot of unhappy and exploitative aspects to it that I don't have time to go into right now. But I'm going to focus on how this team got started and how it got going, and kind of a speculative moment that I had in looking at this team's history. So there they are, Fort Shaw girls basketball team. And they were playing basketball at a time when basketball had just been invented. It was a new American sport, invented in the 1890s. And what really captivated my heart, quite frankly, about the story was that it was a young Blackfeet girl with a chronic medical condition who brought basketball to Fort Shaw. This girl was named Josephine Langley, and you're seeing her team. She built this team, Josie Langley. She's not in the photos because she did have a chronic medical condition. She wasn't able to play by the time these photos were taken, but she trained these girls. When she was 17, in 1893, Josephine Langley was hired at Fort Shaw to serve as a junior staffer. So it wasn't kind of a formal higher level teaching role, was an assistant role. But nevertheless, she innovated that role. She had attended Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, where she saw other girls playing the brand new sport of basketball. Jo Langley had to leave Carlisle because of her eye condition, trachoma. So she had to come back home. That's when she got hired to teach at Fort Shaw. But she brought basketball to Fort Shaw when she was teaching girls athletics. So Josephine convinced the director of the school, the principal of the school, to allow her to teach the girls basketball. She asked for equipment, and he said, "We don't have equipment for girls." So she borrowed the soccer ball from the boys' athletic team, and she and her girls set up baskets outside, like actual baskets of some kind, and they practiced. They practiced learning and playing basketball. I feel myself getting carried away and actually feeling very enthusiastic because what they did is just so incredible. But many of the girls on what would become the team had come from communities where playing ball games and where running freely and where using your body was common and embraced. At school, they had to live like this, right? These stiff dresses. But at home, they could use their bodies, they could move, they could be on the ground. And they seem to have just embraced the notion that they could get that back again by playing basketball. So Jo Langley taught the girls how to play. She kind of argued with school administration to let them have more time to play. And she built a team that became the most winning team in all of Montana. So the Fort Shaw girls team was playing college level teams of other girls in the state of Montana and winning every game. And they then got invited to play at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. Okay, a lot happened at the fair. We're gonna have to jump over some of this. But they did win. They won every game. They won games against Indigenous boys from other boarding schools. They even won games against a team that was a Missouri All-Star team that was put together by a coach of a team at a white school who saw the Fort Shaw girls play. And I can't say for sure what his motivation was, but he determined these girls from Fort Shaw are not going to be the winners. So he went around and he handpicked girls from Missouri and even Illinois to create what was known as the All-Star team. This was an all-star team of white basketball players who he scheduled to play against the Fort Shaw girls. And he thought it was going to be a slam dunk. But no. Fort Shaw girls beat the all-star team more than once and were declared champions of the world. All right, so here's our speculative moment. I mentioned that Josephine Langley learned how to play basketball at Carlisle Indian School. But I didn't mention that before she went to Carlisle, she had actually gone to a smaller religious school, a Catholic school in the valley, in this St. Sun River area called St. Peter's Mission School. And I was really astonished to discover when I was doing this research that a Black woman whose name I'd come across before, looking at a Black woman in the West, Mary Fields, was actually working at this school when Josephine Langley was a student there. Now, Mary Fields is known to some people as the first recognized or known Black woman to have carried the federal mail in the States. She was also herself a formerly enslaved woman. She left West Virginia, went to a convent in Ohio, and when the Ursuline nuns from this convent in Ohio were sent to Montana, she went with them. Mary Fields, formerly enslaved woman, is now at St. Peter's Mission, which was in a remote location, and she was the person responsible for feeding the school. So she had a huge vegetable garden. She kept hundreds of chickens. She was the one who hunted for the school. Everything depended upon her. Well, everything that wanted to live, anybody who wanted to live, depended upon her. But later in her life, Fields was, I think, very cruelly displaced by the Catholic bishop, who in Great Falls, the largest nearby city, who charged Fields with bad language and bad behavior. Some people felt or said that she acted like a man and dressed like a man, and this was a negative for her in their book. And so this Catholic bishop forced her to leave the school, which is basically sending her out with nothing. She was by this point an older woman, but the nuns helped her to get the job carrying the federal mail. And so she carried packages between Great Falls and St. Peter's Mission. And you can see here, this is kind of small, but here's Mary Fields. This is her mail wagon, basically, that she would use to go back and forth, covering 15 miles. So after she carried the mail, when Mary Fields retired, she lived in the town of Cascade, which is nearby, and she became a huge fan of the Cascades baseball team, which was a team of white men. She would go to their games every single time. There are pictures of her standing with the team. Apparently there are reports of her gathering flowers from her garden, making a bouquet, and she would give it to the teammates who had done the best thing on the field that day. So Mary Fields loved sport. She loved baseball. And I couldn't help but think about these two things together. I don't have evidence about this, you all. It's just a hunch. That given that Mary Fields was the person who is provisioning this school, providing everything that this school needed to subsist on during the time that Josephine Langley was a student there, I can't help but think that Mary Fields might have been a coach of sorts to Josephine Langley. Maybe they talked, maybe Fields supported her, maybe Fields told her about what it had been like to be an enslaved girl and woman. Maybe Fields told her about loving working outside. Maybe she encouraged her in what would be an incredibly courageous mission that Langley took up, which was to take on sport as a girl with a chronic illness, to bring that sport to a school that was created to actually subjugate Native children, and to use that sport to help strengthen and elevate other Native girls. All right, here's my conclusion, you all. There are a number of ways in which the projects I have described reflect the flow and change of scholarship in Black and Native studies and histories. What had once been an emphasis on slavery in the Southeast and Indian Territory has now opened up to expanded frameworks and to more locations, and has moved toward a set of integrative analyses and a consideration of how Black and Native lives were contingent. A couple of examples of recent work. I recently published an article on Sacagawea, which is in the journal Places. It's a public history kind of public culture journal focused on landscape and environment. And in this article, what I'm looking at is the way in which an historical enactment about York's activities. York was the enslaved Black man who was compelled to accompany Lewis and Clark on the Lewis and Clark Trail. So a historic reenactment about York's actions completely left out Sacagawea. I attended that event with my family. I was happy to see York being remembered, but shocked that we mentioned Sacagawea, and that led me to write this article. So this is an example of the ways in which we're moving into different locations and expanding some of our questions and points of focus. And here are two more examples of recent works. One is a history by Kyle Mays, who is an Ojibwe and Black historian, and he's the first person who has written a survey about these overlapping, intersecting histories. And another a book that you see the cover of on the slide is a really interesting collection called Say, Listen, Writing as Care. It's written by the Black Indigenous 100s Collective, a group of people who came together during the height of the pandemic to write. And what they argue in this book is that writing and the work that we produce as academics can actually be a form of healing. So I want to stop there and thank you so much for your attention.
Yes.
So we have time for your comments.
We have time for some questions? Yeah. And go ahead. Understand.
Yeah, thank you so much for this amazing work. I am interested, among other things, in the Canadian connection or connections. You already mentioned Top Man, you did the Big Destroy. What do you think would be a useful way, just one way, to extend this important work to Canada?
Yeah. Some of the examples that I discussed, which were anywhere in the middle of the US to the north, are also Canadian stories. Because these are communities that span the border. So the Detroit work is very much a work that looks at Canada. It just has to, because Detroit was also in what is now Canada. And what I found really interesting about that work was that during crisis points, like during the American Revolutionary War, during the War of 1812, families who were spread across the border did better. They were able to rely upon each other across that line of distinction for being able to hide in places, to find safety, to share food. And this also included enslaved people. That's what shocked me the most, that I found enslaved people who were able to rely on Canadian networks that were actually connected to their enslavers. So this is one way, just taking kind of a telescopic lens and looking at the places that existed before there was a border, and that continue to hold communities together. I mean, you can't see, but I'm drawing a circle. Okay, hold communities together, even though the border now comes across it. So for the Montana work, Montana is right on the border, and many of the tribal communities we mentioned were going back and forth across the border. Harriet Tubman, in that case, as you all know, Harriet Tubman lived in St. Catharines for a while, and she was bringing people across the border all the time. And one of the things that I did find inspiring about many of these projects was the way in which people could creatively find ways to use the border to help themselves and help those they cared about. They were creative about that border. And I think that's a message for us today.
Next question, raise your hand. Get the mic, please. Dan Rodriguez.
Thank you, Professor Tina, for your message today and to all here. I greet you. Beyond slavery, was your work able to also expound on any other form of relationships between the indigenous peoples and African peoples beyond the context of slavery? Thank you.
Yes, and thank you very much for that question. This leads me to want to tell you how I entered into the research. So there are a number of African American families that have stories of connections with Native people or Native ancestry in those families. My family is like that, which does not mean that my family is Native or Indigenous. I'm not saying that. Do not quote me as having said that, okay? But it does mean that these stories really do circulate in Black families and Black communities. Many people talk about having a Native ancestor of some kind. Now, some of that can be attributed to kind of a longing or desire, and I've written about that. I have an essay called Uncle Tom Was an Indian, in which I went back and I looked at stories of formerly enslaved people who were claiming Native roots and Native ties, and I was trying to parse out what are those claims based on and what's really going on here. And I ended up arguing in the essay that there was sort of a desire or a wish to be Indigenous on the part of formerly enslaved people and their descendants, because there was an association of strength and freedom with Indigenous peoples. So coming out of that kind of context, where my own grandmother would tell a story about her view or her memory. Again, I say story, you all, about enslaved Black people, quote, escaping to the Indians. So I grew up hearing that. Enslaved Black people escaping to the Indians, and I grew up hearing her own family story of Native connections and even heritage. And I had a very positive view of those relations. And then I took a Native history seminar in graduate school and read a book about the Catawba Nation of the US Southeast. The Catawbas were also a slaveholding nation, and learned about the ways in which Catawbas had adopted slavery and why, and had a chance to talk to the author of that book, James Merrill, who came to our class about the work. That's when I started to realize that there may have been some rose-colored glasses that people were wearing when they thought about positive connections between Black and Native people, when they claimed family ties or maybe invented, but not to do harm, invented out of need and desire and wish to be free and to have a home on those lands, family ties. So I found then that work that had been inspiring to me as potentially very positive was going to have a serious element, which was the fact that, and what I was uncovering in Black and Native relations in these periods, there was more likely to be slavery involved, the enslavement of Black people by Native people, than there was likely to be the beautiful images that we saw in the Francis Yellow drawing. So I started off with positive desire myself as a scholar, confronted the historical findings, and realized I was going to have to tell a different kind of history. So I did that. I told that history. I shared what I found, as discouraging as it was. But in doing that work, and actually a little while after doing that work, I went back and did some more research, looking at the earliest connections between African people, African descendant people, Indigenous peoples of the Southeast. And that revealed a period that I just offered in a glance in my talk, a period of shared circumstances of enslavement. Because in the 1500s, 1600s, early to mid 1700s, African people and Indigenous people of the Americas were both being enslaved. They were enslaved together. And in this context, they were doing the things that Francis Yellow represented on that drawing. They were trading knowledge. They were making pottery. They were developing intimate relationships. They were having children. One of the interesting parts of this that you see in really archaeological and anthropological literature is the way in which Native enslaved men taught Black enslaved men how to make dugout canoes. the way in which Native enslaved women taught Black enslaved women which kind of plants, such as sweetgrass, could be woven for baskets and would be good for making baskets in the Southeast. So there were generative relationships. We can't really see into those because we don't have the records. And actually, many of these plantation records, when they describe people who were probably African and American Indigenous peoples, they just call them Negro. They call them, all Negro, or they'll call them mulatto, or they'll call them Musty, or they'll call them even Métis. And these terms hide the specificity of those people's backgrounds. So we can't really see in as close as we want to see, but the records we have do indicate that there were close and abiding relationships between individuals in these groups, especially when they were kind of on a level playing field with each other. I mean, the sad thing is, and this is the thing about human beings in general, that once colonial officials kind of recognized the risk of Indigenous and African people joining forces, they did their best to keep them separate. And I'm not making this up. This is in the records. I see nods. Maybe you've seen some of this, read some of this history back there. This is in the records of John Stewart, who was the British Commissioner of Indian Affairs, who was in South Carolina, said this, that the Indians and Negroes had to be kept apart. And colonial policy, the policy that I mentioned earlier about kind of encouraging Cherokees, but also other nations to own Black people as slaves, flowed in part from that understanding, was that division was going to be important for those who wanted to remain in power. And we can also say the same about class division in colonial America. The understanding that a way to keep poor, or let's just say working class white men in check, to discourage them from recognizing these harsh disparities, was to turn them against Indigenous people and African people and encourage them to see that they were very different from these populations because they were white, these populations were of color. So I hope that gets at some of what it was you were asking.
Yes, am I able to? I really want to say thank you for it, even though it's could be a sensitive topic, but I think the importance of we gathering here as scholars is because we reshape and shape these narratives. A renowned Canadian scholar from the worlds of OISE, Nana fondly called Professor Day, he cautioned with something, and I'm glad you gave a timeline in order to allow for certain understanding. Studying the history from the 1400s, what does that do to humanity? What does that do to us as a people? Because we existed before the 1400s. We existed before what is being described or called as the white man today became. When I do have a course that I teach, and in that course, when we look at the map of the world, just here, you will, and when through practical experience, just an analogy, there will be a point in Senegal, you will stand, you're already looking at South Africa, just South America, sorry, divided by the water, by the sea. Now, if we're talking about America today, we know that when we talk America, we're talking about Mexico. Mexico is America. South America is Mexico. So the point becomes that there existed a relationship before there was the invention of the white man that became also the invention of slavery, whether the Aryan or white and all. The importance of this lecture is to help us reveal what is. I will just also encourage a part of that portion that will help us see the humanity in us before the slavery that, or the divide, and you said the capitalism, it's all in different phases. that divides. So that sometime if we can go way back, and I know you did mention where are the records, indigenous peoples do have those records. I'm an indigenous trained woman as well, and those records are there and valid. And whatever way we could work together to make it a whole story and not a single story, so that in leaving or departing from these lectures like that, we're also leaving with a sense of what we had in common before there was the divide. Thank you very much again, Professor.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're gonna stop there for first, and thank you very much for your participation and all that good stuff. Professor, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope you felt at home to get OISE and that joy you talked about in your work. On behalf of our dean, who is not here, and all was our associate dean and everyone, I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
And we took a good flag. We did get good flag at OISE. We're gonna continue this conversation, so please do not leave us yet. We're gonna continue this conversation among ourselves, and there's a reception at the back, have something to drink, talk to someone, come and greet the professors as well, and we engage. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
It's important.
Yes, you do right here back there.
So nice to meet you. I'm Jen.
Thank you so much.
You're the one back there nodding.
Yeah.
Yes.
I absolutely love this room. I attended going. I'm like